Hi, welcome back to another ET Talk. I'm Cole Camplese, Vice President for Technology and Chief Information Officer at the University of Texas at Austin. And today for episode 10, we have something that I was hoping we'd get to in the first few weeks, but we had to sort of lay a little bit of a foundation, but now I think it's on. I'm dubbing this a very special episode of ET Talk, and I'm joined here with my truly good friend and colleague, Julie Schell. Hi, Julie.
Hey, Cole. How's it going?
It's going great. Thanks for taking the time to be on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. I'm so excited to be here and to talk about things I know we both really care about.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the neat things about what's going to happen here today is that we exist sort of in the same plane, but maybe we have a lens that comes from different perspectives of that same plane. So before we get started, though, do you mind just giving us a little introduction of yourself and
Sure.
Your background?
I'm Julie Schell. I'm Assistant Vice Provost of Academic Technology and the Director of our Office of Academic Technology here at UT Austin. And I call myself the steward of effective learning with technology.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. But you've had an interesting weaving journey to get to this place. Like when I started doing some background on you, I mean, I knew about your time at the Missouri group at Harvard, where little things like peer review and flipped classrooms
Right.
sort of were birthed. But you were a law clerk and at Stanford.
I was in the actually my journey started at in Nevada
Yeah.
at the University of Nevada, Reno.
Okay.
And I'm definitely here today because of a turning point that happened there. So
Interesting.
I had a teacher who really invested a lot in helping me understand something that was very, very challenging and very difficult for me, and that was mechanics or physics.
No kidding.
And I was just really bad at it. And he happened to be the chair of the department. He was a very active research faculty member. And he just opened his door every day for me. And we would sit and he would stand at the chalkboard and try to walk me through the physics problems. And it was just so hard for me and so difficult for me. But eventually I got it. And we did enough scaffolding and he created enough conditions that it really connected for me. And I ended up succeeding in the class. And I think sitting here today, I can track everything back to that.
Really?
Yeah.
Last week on the last episode, I had John Dalton, our VP for Student Affairs, and it's interesting, like I'll call it his origin story. In a similar way, he had somebody who got to him early in his academic career that changed his entire arc through, I guess we look back in the rearview mirror as that is mentorship. But when you're that age, I don't know that we really notice it as mentorship. Right?
Yeah.
Like we sort of look at it as just, oh, maybe that's that person's job.
Well, something that happened there is that he believed that I could learn this highly complex topic.
Mm-hmm.
And I became convinced, and I have been convinced since then, that anybody can learn anything if the conditions are right. And I've dedicated my career in particular to doing some deep dives into really complex topics and trying to understand particularly how to help novices learn those complex topics. And I think my physics professor, when we were sitting there in those moments during his office hours, would be shocked to know or predict that I would be doing a postdoc in a Harvard laser physics lab many years from there. But I did end up telling him that, and we still talk today. So
that's really interesting. But how did then you make the leap out of that space into learning sciences, psychology? Like, what does that connection look like?
Well, from that experience, I really just became fascinated with how people learn complex topics. And so after undergrad, I did a master's in educational psychology.
Okay.
And I focused in on human-computer interaction, actually. And I was learning how to help teachers learn to adopt technology for in their classrooms, but from a cog-sci learning point of view. Ended up going to Stanford after that and working as a student affairs officer and really trying to understand that in an environment where I had never been exposed to the law, I'd never been exposed to legal clerkships, and I ended up doing 2 years there and then realizing that this fascination with how people learn complex things and the role of the teacher in that relationship was really something that I was very compelled and curious about understanding. So ended up going to Teachers College and doing my doctorate there and studying something kind of obscure, which was teaching improvement effort. I wasn't actually
Interesting.
studying the teaching improvement. I was studying the effort.
So, okay, so now I'm off on a tangent here, and I got to ask, what does that really mean? They're not studying the teaching, but the effort.
The effort to improve one's teaching, I looked at how does someone enact effort and why does someone enact effort to improve their teaching. At that time, at a Research One university, I was looking at STEM faculty in Research One universities. There aren't a lot of incentives for improving
No, there really aren't.
Right. So why and how? One of the reasons why is people have a moral impulse. That's what I found, a moral impulse to work on their teaching and to have these relationships that breathe life into the subject matter so it takes flight off the page in some ways. And so that was something that it really launched me further into this journey around what learning is and how do we help people learn things.
Yeah, how do you unlock that intrinsic motivation that
Right.
drives people toward saying, like you, oh, actually I can do this physics problem.
Right.
And have that translate into some post-event combination of motivation and curiosity. Right? It's a really neat swim lane to think about.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And what I think about when I think of like improving teaching, and I've been at multiple universities, and we all have the same sort of Center for Teaching and Learning, or at Penn State we had the Schreier Institute
Right.
and the overall impression of that was always that's where the faculty go when they're not doing well.
Right.
Right. It's like getting
Right.
sent to the principal's office.
Right.
And that always struck me as sort of completely upside down.
Right. It's funny that you say that because I had this philosopher, I had an educational philosopher on my committee, on my dissertation committee. And when I was first pitching ideas, I wanted to study teaching excellence. And that was sort of the thing I was interested in at that time because I thought my definition of teaching excellence was this professor that I had. And he
Right.
said, well, what about the people who aren't excellent? What's worthy about their experiences? And that's actually how I got to the effort.
So, and I came at it from I came more through the instructional technology
Right.
side. Like, I pay attention to teaching and learning and how that occurs, but maybe it was just the time and place that I grew up. I brought forward more of a technology-focused lens on that, and always thinking about how the technology was going to help influence or shape the teacher. And I have this great colleague back at Penn State, Scott McDonald, in the College of Education, where he always said, like, we're the mirror opposites of each other. Like, and that, I mean, he's a better looking version of me, but he
Right.
looks just like me.
Uh-huh.
So we are sort of like face off.
Right.
And we always talked about the fact that he leads with pedagogy and I lead with technology, but somewhere in that combination, there
Yeah.
are moments that really unlock something inside of certain instructors.
Yeah, and students. And I think that's where
Yeah.
that intersection becomes really interesting is that there are times where technology can breathe life into that subject matter and create representations that a human can't do. Right. And so when a teacher knows how to do that, we call that, and I'm sure you know the term, technological pedagogical content
Yep.
knowledge, which is this amalgam of how to teach
Right.
and how to teach a particular subject and how to use technology to make those representations come alive in ways that you can't do without it.
Why do you think that we had let me try that again. Let me think about that a little differently. We had this boom time in ed tech,
Right.
So we're in, what would you say, like 2009
Yeah.
through about
That was-
2017 or 18
Yeah.
maybe. MOOCs and Web
Yeah.
2.0.
Yeah.
And at that point, I saw a huge number of faculty, by comparison to what you usually see,
Right.
adopting these new technologies and actually using them in new and novel ways.
Yeah.
Do you think that is a time that will just exist as a capsule, or do you think we're still in it or we're returning to it?
I don't think we're quite in that right now, but I remember that time because when I was in the Mazur group, Eric Mazur is a physicist, and he's well known for using technology in these ways to enhance and augment
Yep.
pedagogy. And in fact, he's he's known as one of the early inventors of the clicker, right? And when I was in the lab, we were trying to move from hardware to software clickers. And it was a really exciting time, right?
Yeah.
Because you can do so much more when you can capture, when it's not just sort of limited
Right.
to a clicker. I mean, you can type, you can have heat maps, you can have touch and haptic interactions. And so I remember that time really fondly, and really being at this discovery point, particularly in physics, because we were looking at physics for non-physics majors.
Okay.
How technology can help people understand and learn in ways that is not possible without it. And one of the big things around that, which I know that you will relate to, is the social learning aspects
Yes.
that technology
You've
can.
heard me say that learning is a social endeavor.
Right,
Probably
exactly.
way too many times now.
Right. And so we did this work on identifying natural teachers. So Eric is known for peer instruction.
Yep.
Turn to your neighbor, try to convince them of your answer. And one of the things we were able to do when we moved to a software version of this was find and track people who were naturally able to convince their neighbor who had the wrong answer of the right answer. And so
Yes.
that's just not, you can see learning. I'm really interested and fascinated by how we can see learning with technology. We can see performance really easy with technology.
Right.
Super easy to see performance, but to see learning, and that's where I hope we're onto something really different and really new right now that is just sort of totally different than that capsule that we were in before.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. And we are in a wildly different time at that point because, you are one of these very unique individuals in higher education. I mean, you're a learning scientist. You live at the intersection of technology and teaching and learning, but you're also a builder, and you're also a product owner, and you're also creating the rules and the policies that we adhere to when we use these technologies. Right. That's a really interesting combination of roles, responsibilities, but I think more interestingly, identities.
Absolutely. And there's actually a through line through all of those, right? Through teacher, through learner, through leader, through builder, through policymaker. And right now, I think that through line for me is tension and friction. And I find myself sitting in that through line all day long.
And I would say that same tension and friction existed back when we were in those formative days of really, and it's not the infusion of technology, because for God's sakes, the chalkboard is a technology that was highly disruptive in our classrooms, you know, back in the 1800s. And when we first came out with movie projectors in classrooms, very disrupt, radio, all of those things.
Right.
And all of them create a friction in the pedagogy.
Absolutely.
And where do you think faculty are going today to unpack those affordances embedded in the technology? So if we go back to the chalkboard, I'm sure you've heard me say that teachers, elementary teachers, write with big loopy letters, not because they all had the same handwriting teacher, but that was a pedagogical practice to unlock the broadcast capability of the chalkboard.
Right.
Where and how can, with the technology that is really, we're swimming in it, the chalkboard was something that got placed in a room.
Yeah.
What do we do now when the technology is the ambient, almost oxygen in every room?
So I had an experience last semester in my class. I teach a class called Design Pedagogy. And in that class, the students are charged with learning how to teach. And we have a lesson where the students have to make a video pitch, a video trailer of an object that they've designed, 3D object, to teach someone a topic that was difficult for them to learn. And I'm a very AI forward person. I'm experimenting with AI all the time, and I want my students to be experimenting with AI as well and thinking along with AI. And so I had a very AI forward policy in my class. And when in 2003, there were some video tools that were enabled, and I noticed during that lesson that my students were offloading the creation of their pitch videos to AI, and that was permitted. I didn't bar it, but I thought to myself, this isn't them. I want them. And I realize now, after thinking about that the task of the teacher is different.
So say a little bit more about that, because I think that that's a really important point that overlaps both of our professional worlds here at the university.
Absolutely. I think this is where we connect.
Yeah.
So I heard Ellie Shopik share a narrative about what the role of a coder is now
Right.
in the era of AI, right? That a coder no longer, the job of a coder is no longer to sit down and write the code. That the real skill is reading, correcting, and augmenting the code with their
Yes.
foundational expertise, like what they have to have in order to do that. And one thing where we sit, like tension and friction are cousins, right? So when we're sitting in the tension as the teacher, I was thinking, oh, what's happening here where my students are using AI. And I'm reading the AI, or I'm reading the output of the AI, and I'm thinking, I'm not seeing the learning happening
Right.
there. I'm not seeing the learning. And so in a similar way, I don't think the role of the teacher, so you asked what people are doing right now. I think some people are going to old practices, like let's have oral assessment. There's this nostalgia for
Yeah,
the
the
old.
blue book.
Yeah, there's
Yep.
some nostalgia.
We heard that at the ethical AI day.
Absolutely. And I see it in students and I see it in teachers as well. There's some nostalgia for the old days, right, of where we do oral recitations. And
Yep.
and I'm sitting in that tension and trying to understand it right now, but I actually think the role of the teacher right now is to learn to read learning in new ways and to be able to critically discern whether the learning is happening. And that's where I think we get to where some really exciting things can happen if the teacher will take on that new ability.
But that's the issue,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Whereas before it was very much like, okay, I can learn how to push the button
Right.
in the technology to make it work,
Right,
and then we would elevate it to when
right,
and to what effect.
right.
But now we're asking them to learn the output in more of a reflected way,
Right,
coming back to them from their student, a lot like we do with assignments and homework.
right.
But it's I want to make sure that I'm following. It's
Yeah.
not the product that's so important.
Right.
It's the audit trail of the work that got them to that product.
It's the learning that they are the only ones can recognize, right? So for
Right.
me, it wasn't that they were using AI, it was that I couldn't see the markers of teaching, and that's what they were being assigned to
Yeah,
do.
but that is still very familiar to the notion of like reflective practice and
Absolutely.
metacognition and
Right.
writing about your outcome in
Right.
a reflective way instead of just leaning on the paper itself.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's the skill shift. I don't think the skill shift is going back. I think the skill shift is for teaching is going forward, and part of that going forward is learning how to. I think it kind of I can organize it in these three sort of concepts that I got from a paper by a person from Berkeley. These three concepts around what does the faculty member need to be able to do with AI. And the first is just recognize the skill deficit that's going to happen if the student does something like use AI to entirely create a pitch video.
Right.
So what is lost, right? And then to be able to articulate that to the student. But then I think so I think what some people are doing right now is they really recognize that. That's super intuitive.
Yeah, I see it.
Right. You
I
see
know
it,
about it myself.
You know it in yourself.
Yeah.
You can see it in yourself. You can see it in your staff. You can see it in the people that you
Yep.
teach, right? That it's pretty obvious when the skill deficit is going to occur and when that's going to be harmful and when some atrophy is going to come out of that. But what I think, if we turn away from it and we go back to sort of the old ways that we are nostalgic for, we lose the opportunity for the two new things that I think we need to be
Okay.
doing as teachers, and that's task augmentation. So how can we learn how to use AI in ways that connect with the student, that augments their learning and makes it so much better and so much more rigorous.
Just like the new role of the coder that you just mentioned.
Exactly, exactly. And maybe the student uses AI to brainstorm what the learning gaps are going to be in this lesson. Or let's take the Pythagorean theorem for an example. Skill deficit is, here are my homework problems. do them for me and make a couple mistakes so it doesn't look like I did it. That's like a skill deficit. They're going to have a skill deficit if they do that.
Right.
Augmentation is, here are my homework problems. Make me 10 different ones from scratch, make them harder, and then give me all of them and give me feedback on where I might be missing some underlying structure in how I'm answering, and don't give me the answers, right? So that's augmentation. And if we can teach students to do that, I think we're on to something really exciting.
Yeah, and I don't want to interrupt you, but
No.
it takes me right back to your origin story.
Right,
Right? He was another human,
right.
but augmenting.
Absolutely.
And now, and that's what's sort of fascinating about the AI moment is that if we can teach students that new literacy,
Right,
they have a always on companion
right.
who can be an expert in helping them identify their gaps and scaffolding them toward where they really need to get to without those deficits.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that, I think there's some tension and some friction around where I think these models are right now with teaching.
Yeah.
So one of the things I find is, and I know you speak my language on this, but there's teacher-centered teaching and then there's student-centered teaching,
That's
right?
right.
And we've moved towards the student-centered model, and we've got a lot of evidence that student-centered teaching is what's going to produce thriving
Yes.
in the classroom. But when I interact a lot with the models, one of the things I see is they operate more in a teacher-centered approach, and that's because
they do. Yeah.
right, because people train them, and people
Yeah.
unless there's an intervention,
That's right.
you're going to teach in a teacher-centered focus. What's the topic?
Mhm.
How did I learn this? What book should I use? Right. Whereas with AI, whereas a student-centered approach, you want to start with who are they?
That's right.
What do they need to know? What do they need to learn to be able to do? As I was building a lesson plan with AI the other day, because I'm trying to help people understand the concept of tokens. I think it's fundamental.
It is, but I was talking to a very important person on our campus the other day, and he asked me, so just tell me what these damn token things are.
Okay, so I was making a lesson plan in AI for this purpose, right? And I said, okay, make sure you give me some learning outcomes, right? Give me the content, and then give me an assessment and put in some feedback on correctness and some explanatory feedback, and just basic on token, right? So it builds the lesson plan, and okay, that's exciting. I see the learning outcome. It's well-written learning outcome.
Mm-hmm.
But then I'm reading the content, and it's exposing me to a lot of content that was tangential to the learning outcome, and didn't expose me to one piece. So the learning outcome was about tokens and context windows. It didn't expose me to anything about context windows. And then we got down to the assessment. It didn't ask me anything about, it wasn't tagged to the learning outcomes
Right.
or to the content.
Right.
And so I thought to myself,
It's
okay,
kind of ironic.
there's some tension
yeah.
here, right, though? So how much of that should we expect the teacher to do? So there was friction for me,
Right.
but I haven't decided yet. So is that just a prompting issue on my part? How much should we expect the model to be student-centered in the way that it teaches?
Well, and then the next question I would ask is, how do you flip that script? And can you do that as an individual with your own environment?
Right.
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 And, not to brag too much on you, but you're a member of Anthropic's Higher Education
That's
Advisory
right.
Board, which is a marker because they don't have a lot of real academics from real R1 institutions helping to inform products in the teaching space.
Right.
Right? And I wonder, as we onboard these kinds of tools into our landscape, how much care should students take in setting up their environment and being able to add to the memory that they want to be taught in a student-centered way, that maybe every learning session starts with the agent asking them questions
Right.
about themselves and where they are.
Right.
Right?
Absolutely. And, context awareness is really important
Mm-hmm.
in these models, but how much context awareness does a human being need to be in this new environment where we are going to be using these tools to be learners? Does everyone need to be an instructional designer,
Right.
right? Or do we need the models to get better at that? I'm sitting in that tension. I'm curious what you think.
I don't know. I mean, the way I've been thinking about a lot of this within my own organization is through shareable skills
Right.
within environments. And, maybe it's just because I'm naturally curious and I'm drawn to these kinds of things. But I have found that I've been leading a lot of the AI conversations, not as like the boss,
Right.
but more as a practitioner.
Right.
Right? Like I've been doing things really down in the weeds. And what I've discovered is that other people are asking me for the secret sauce
Right.
that I use to get to outcomes. And it's taken me a while to really understand how these environments are working, but it's pretty clear that I could share any skill created within Claude with you, and that instance will just pick up as if it's talking to me.
Right.
Which is fascinating when you start thinking about what does a skill library look like, or a skill index on this campus. So no, not everybody needs to be instructional designer, because the top instructional designers on this campus could, in effect, define almost like a choose your own adventure storybook that could load those skills into a faculty member's environment, and they can call them, and all of a sudden we scale instructional design.
Absolutely.
That's what, to me, I don't think the models are going to fundamentally get to the place where they're going to be able to take on our personalities without significant intervention from us.
Right.
And I think the more we invest in using the tool as our authentic self, it begins to reflect the way that we like to work, like to think. And I get much better first, second, third prompt outputs now because my environment has so much context about me.
Absolutely.
And that's a very student-centered or VP-centered model. It's really kind of interesting. I do have to ask you a big question.
Sure.
Though. Like I said, you build, you deploy, and you make policy. UT Sage is something that you dreamed up, where most campuses would have run out and just bought the Johnny-come-lately off-the-shelf AI agent.
Right.
I think most of our peers across the country are watching our experiment in this space. How did we have your origin story? What's the Sage origin story? Because I showed up, and one of my first meetings was in a room with AWS where this thing was already being built.
Yeah, so it was November 14th.
Oh, come on. Are you really
it was really November 20th.
Did you fall off the toilet and hit your head and you saw a diagram of the flux capacitor?
No, but it was, so I think my point there is I think it was like a week after OpenAI released custom GPTs.
Okay.
And I had been sort of on a waiting list to get the license, and I finally got it. And so I was up late just playing with making a bunch of custom GPTs, and I was thinking about how hard it is to learn how to write an effective learning outcome. And I was teaching at the time, and so I thought, well, let me see if I can build a custom GPT to teach learning outcomes. About 15 minutes later, I was testing it, I was prototyping and testing, and I saw what it was doing. I saw the output of this custom GPT and how I was, mirroring as a student and having the experience that the student and I shot back from my desk and I thought, this is going to change everything.
Really?
And I messaged my then boss at the time with a message saying, I built this. This is incredible. I think this is a really important moment.
Yeah.
And that was the birth of Sage.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So give the listener, because we have one listener, it's me, what's the soundbite on Sage? So for people that don't know, they have to go out and do a little research on their own. But
sure.
I mean, you use the made by Texas, but like, how do you describe it? Like if you're stuck in the elevator and you're doing a pitch.
Sure. So Sage is an AI platform that uses Claude to help teachers and students learn effectively with AI.
And students experience this not in Claude, they experience this as a link from within Canvas.
Right. They
Right.
experience this in our own environment.
So it's within their learning space.
Correct.
Which is a big differentiator.
It's
I
within
think.
their learning space, and more than just virtual physical space, within the learning space that is created by their teacher, by their professor. Because I think one of the relative advantage of Sage, when we talk to students and what they tell us about the relative advantage of Sage, is that their faculty member trained the tutor. So their faculty member is guiding the tutor
Right.
to and endorsing in those ways, endorsing the experience that the student is going to have. So if we take this Pythagorean theorem example, again, a faculty member can build up a tutor with Sage on the faculty member side. They can identify the learning outcomes. They can identify the common misconceptions. A lot of students, for example, don't know that you can use the Pythagorean theorem to measure distances, right? Because they don't know the underlying basis about right triangles. So, those are misconceptions that your pedagogical content knowledge builds up over time as a teacher, and you know that. And this is what I think is so amazing about AI. That PCK, or that pedagogical content knowledge, is rarely surfaced. We know it intuitively, but we don't share it with other people.
Right.
Teaching is typically something that we do in isolation from others.
That's interesting.
So
Yeah.
we don't sit and talk about our PCK necessarily, but Sage asks the faculty member to surface that, and then to write out over time, what have you learned that helps students with those misconceptions. And so when students are engaging with Sage, they are engaging with all of the expertise that the general model has, but they are also getting the human expertise of their particular faculty member.
Right.
And that's not something that's going to be in the model, that intuition.
But that's that augmentation. But,
Correct.
But in a producer to learner perspective in the other direction.
Right. And there's still a lot of friction and tension and friction sort of within Sage. And when you're building something instead of buying something, you can be really excited about what you can do and the problems that you can solve, right? And there wasn't a way for us to kind of map all of these misconceptions and the student-centered teaching into what was existing. And so we thought about, well, what could we do? And you have to make some trade-offs, right? So, for example, a lot of people, when they make tutors, they make them for the whole class.
Right.
We made Sage at the lesson or the topic level.
Okay.
2 reasons, right? One is a pedagogical reason, and here's this tension in all building and product development that we have to pay attention to. Pedagogical reason, it's lower threshold to get started with one
Absolutely.
concept, right?
Absolutely.
So we can get them in on that. But also tokens, they cost a lot. A whole course is going to be a lot more.
And the context window and everything
Exactly.
associated with it. And so you're ending up, and that's the one thing that we know about the leading models is they're jagged.
Right, exactly.
Right? Like they can solve the calculus equation, but they can't tell you what time it is.
Right.
And so I think the tighter you can pack that information
Right.
is better. A little bit of a different question, but related. I know that you had a really big hand in the COVID response here. My daughter lost half her senior year of high school, no graduation, no prom, and then lost most of her freshman year. Although she was resident at Northeastern, it was de-densified and mostly online. Max spent 7th and 8th grade year completely online. How do you think those students would have, and those instructors would have approached something like Sage during that window, when you think back to that time? I mean, I remember, like, we were all scrambling just to put stuff online, for God's sakes. But,
Right.
But I'm curious, like, it seems like a tool like Sage would have been an ideal companion for every student during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that. And I think, there's a way of I think what Sage does that some of these other more generic things do, and what students tell us, is that it's their faculty that's made it, right? So
Right.
there's a relationship, and we have these
And maybe a
principles.
trust.
Yeah, a trust, and the faculty member also trusts the tool as well. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody needs to build something just to do that, but I think it's something interesting about it. One of my favorite stories about Sage is from a student who was in a research methods class, and they had a statistics problem that they were working on, and the student couldn't get Sage to do what he wanted it to do, right? So here's where something interesting is happening to me when it comes to learning. So what do you do when you face that friction, right? Because there's friction.
Yep.
So some people would just say, well, I'm going to go to the general model and figure this out. It's going to do a better job. I'm not going to bother with Sage on this. Well, this student spent a couple hours trying to debug why Sage wasn't doing that.
Unbelievable.
Sent his faculty member the code that he did to debug it, and then wrote, please pass this, figured out it was like an attribution error that was happening, figured out what was wrong, execution error, and asked his faculty member to pass it on to the developers so that they could fix it. And so what's fascinating to me about this is not Sage didn't work, but this is a type of learning that I think is so important. It is not performance.
No, it's
right?
authentic.
And we've spent all of this time
Yep.
figuring out how to measure performance, and everything is weighted on performance. I think we have an opportunity right now to try to figure out with AI. I think, I might be dreaming here, but I think there's a way to have a learning index within these models that would show up and say, how much metacognition is this student engaging in? How much self-regulation is this student engaging in? How is is it low or high self-efficacy that this student has? And not only to reflect that to the teacher, but to reflect it to the student.
So, because we're going to be deploying platforms in mass, I think we do have an opportunity to go beyond just enculturating that kind of approach. I think we could actually be more prescriptive in that space.
Yeah.
Where we could, we were just talking about skills. There's nothing saying that we couldn't. I mean, the AI platform is any application you want it to be.
Right.
So it's a blog, it's a note-taking environment, it's anything you commit to memory
Right.
as part of the memory. It's what I'm beginning to see with my work is that I'm asking it to track my own professional and intellectual development on the projects that I'm building with it. And I've created an agent called Carl.
Uh-huh.
And Carl keeps track of all my things, and I've asked him, I want him to write my biography.
Got you.
But I want him to write it from the perspective of my journey at my time at the University of Texas. So
Right.
all my interactions, Carl is an agent that's now running in the background, keeping track of that and saving that into a narrative, like essentially flat file database.
Right. Right, because I think, again, learning is just really hard to see, right? All learning is the making of memories. That's my point of view. All learning is the making of memories.
I love that. And, this has been an amazing conversation, but I do have to ask you a tough question, and that is, if you could share something with our faculty that you would love for them to go out and do next week, like if you could put something on, like automatically add it to their Microsoft to-do list, what do you think that one thing, like what would be that one ask?
Think about a teaching problem that you have, right? So for me, one of my, a teaching problem I have is that it's really hard for students to write learning outcomes. I teach teaching, so, that's a topic for me. It's really hard. I always have this challenge. They give it a go, but they're really hard to write. So they're not specific, or they're not measurable, or they're not tagged.
No, I did a
rest of the
master's degree learning how to
Yeah,
do that.
exactly.
Yeah,
So you know what I mean.
It's a really hard thing
Right.
to do
So
effectively.
my first piece of advice is find a problem. Find a problem that you're curious about, or that you've always had, and ask one of the models. You give it some context, and ask one of the models to experiment with you, to think along with you, to help you think about solving it. I mean, that's how Sage was born.
And that's what all of our offices collectively were designed to help faculty with. And
Right.
I've used very similar language throughout my career. Is like, we're not going to try to boil the ocean with your class.
Right.
We're going to find the space that's causing you stress or tension
Right.
or friction, and we're going to do an intervention on that moment in time.
Right.
But as you know, on a campus with 15,000 faculty members,
Right.
that approach does not scale.
Right.
So what I'm excited about our future work together on this is how we bring the power of our two organizations to bear on how do we finally impact authentic learning, authentic teaching, and these other concepts that we've talked about today together. And I think that that's what's so exciting to me about the age of AI is that it's not the death of assessment, it's not the death of real learning. What it is it's opening up an entirely new paradigm
Right.
for us to scale our intelligence, but also for individuals to scale and scaffold their own intelligence.
Absolutely.
And it can be anything.
And I'm really excited because I think where, as I mentioned before, I'm sort of sitting in this tension all the time. And I think part of that tension is every technology decision can create a constraint on the pedagogy side, and every pedagogical decision can create a constraint on the technology side.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way forward is to bring those two together, and amplify what we're trying to do to solve these problems. But I'm really excited about that work.
Yeah, and I just feel so lucky to be at this university at this time.
Same.
And I can say my time here has been a hell of a lot more interesting and exciting having you as a colleague. So I want to thank you for just the time that you've taken to spend with me as I've come up to speed in the first 2 years. And just want to say that we are getting ready to do some amazing things over the next couple of years here, and I'm really excited about it.
I can't wait to be on this frontier with you,
It's
Cole.
fun.
Thank
It's
you
fun.
so much.
Well, thank you, and thank you to everybody else for ET Talk, Cole Camplese and my good friend Julie Schell. This episode will be followed by a number of other really great episodes. We have some really interesting guests coming, but I know Julie's going to be back in the chair, and we'll be talking about SAGE and all the other experiments that we have going on. So thank you all for downloading and tuning in today.